Rome didn't fall in a battle. It died in silence. For centuries, we have been obsessed with the noise of the end. We look for the smoke rising over the Forum, the thunder of barbarian hooves on the Appian Way, and the agonizing screams of an empire being torn apart by steel. We want the fall of Rome to be a climax cinematic explosion that marks a clear boundary between the light of civilization and the darkness of what followed. But history is rarely that kind. Real empires do not die with a bang. They die with a whimper. They do not collapse because their walls are breached. They collapse because they have already been hollowed out from within. If you want to find the exact second the Roman heartbeat faltered, you must ignore the year 410 AD. You must look past the fires and the sieges. You have to go back 200 years earlier, to a freezing, snow-dusted military tent on the Danube frontier. It is the night of March 17, 180 AD. The air is bitter, carrying the scent of wet earth, pine, and the stagnant breath of a dying man. Inside a modest imperial tent, lit by a single flickering candle, lies Marcus Aurelius. He is the last of the 5 good emperors, a philosopher king who spent his life burdened by the weight of a world he knew was fragile. He is a man of stoic discipline, a ruler who viewed power not as a prize, but as a duty. As he draws his final ragged breaths, a golden age known as the Pax Romana, 2 centuries of relative peace and stability, dies with him. To the outside world, nothing looked different that night. The legions were still the most terrifying fighting force on the planet. The Roman bureaucracy still hummed with the efficiency of 1,000 years of experience. The marble of the Capitol still gleamed under the Mediterranean sun. But as Marcus Aurelius's hand went cold, the crown was taken by his 19-year-old son, Commodus. For the first time in a century, the throne of Rome was not occupied by a man chosen for his merit, wisdom, or character. It was occupied by a boy chosen by his blood. This was the silent infection. This was the exact second the soul of the empire began to rot. The tragedy of Rome's death is that it started with a shift in the ego. Commodus did not care for the heavy scrolls of philosophy or the tedious meetings of the Senate. He did not care for the lonely vigil on the frontiers or the delicate balance of the law. He cared only for the roar of the crowd. He was the first emperor to abandon the dignity of the palace for the dirt of the arena. He dressed himself as Hercules, draped in lion skins, and stepped into the Colosseum to slaughter animals and disabled men, while the administration of the world crumbled in his absence. He traded the sacred duty of an emperor for the cheap, fleeting applause of the masses. He was a showman, not a leader, and in an empire built on the character of its rulers, a showman is a death sentence. When a leader stops serving the state and starts serving his own vanity, the clock starts ticking. But ego is an expensive addiction, and the bill for Commodus's games would eventually bankrupt the world. To fund his lavish spectacles and his personal whims, Commodus committed a crime that was more devastating than any barbarian invasion. He attacked the currency. He slashed the silver content of the Roman denarius, the lifeblood of the imperial economy. It was the birth of hyperinflation, a silent, invisible killer. Within years, the coin that once commanded respect from Britain to the Euphrates became a lie. Prices skyrocketed. The social contract, which relied on the stability of Roman value, began to incinerate. The farmer in Gaul and the merchant in Egypt realized that the gold and silver they held were no longer symbols of power, but fragments of a fading memory. And once a society's money becomes a lie, its faith in the future evaporates. People stopped investing. They stopped planning. They began to hoard, to hide, and to survive. The empire was no longer a living, growing entity. It had become a gilded cage, and the bars were beginning to rust. The military, the iron skeleton of Rome, was the next to succumb to the rot. As the money lost its value, the loyalty of the legions was no longer a matter of duty. It was a matter of the highest bidder. Generals realized that the path to ultimate power did not involve defending the cold, muddy borders against Germanic tribes. It involved marching on Rome to install their own puppet emperors. The throne became a revolving door of blood. In the decades following Commodus's inevitable assassination, Rome endured the crisis of the 3rd century, a period of total systemic failure. Rome saw 26 emperors in just 50 years. Most were murdered by their own men before they could even finish their first year in office. The empire's central nervous system was dying. The legendary Roman roads, once the veins of global trade, grew dangerous and overgrown. Trade routes that had connected the world for centuries snapped like dry twigs. Cities that had been open, vibrant, and confident for generations began to build massive walls, turning inward, becoming fortresses of fear. The world was shrinking, not because an external enemy was pushing the borders back, but because the internal belief in a shared Roman identity had withered away. We look at the history books and see the Goths, the Vandals, and the Huns. We see them as the killers of Rome, but they were merely the scavengers. They were the wolves who arrived only once they realized the lion could no longer stand. They did not break Rome. They simply found a body that was already cold. The real tragedy is that Rome spent its final 2 centuries as a ghost, haunting its own ruins. By the time the gates were opened to Alaric in 410 AD, the spirit had left the room long ago. The lights were still on, but the empire had died on that cold Danube night in 180 AD. The lesson for our modern world is chilling in its simplicity. Civilizations do not collapse because they run out of resources. They collapse because they run out of character. They die when the arena becomes more important than the assembly. They fall when the good emperors, the leaders who view power as a heavy, stoic responsibility, are replaced by those who view it as a stage for their own ego. Rome teaches us that greatness is not a permanent state. It is a fragile flame that requires constant, selfless tending. History is not a straight line. It is a wheel. We assume that because our walls are still standing, because our markets are still open, and because our marble still shines, that the empire is alive. But the fall of Rome reminds us that the exact second of death is often quiet. It is a single heartbeat that stops, a single leader who chooses vanity over virtue, and 1,000 years of history that begin to unravel while the crowd is still cheering. If you had been in that tent on the Danube, watching a young, arrogant boy take the imperial ring from his father's cold hand, would you have seen the end coming? Or would you have been like the millions of others, assuming that because the legions were still marching, the world would never change? The eternal city proved to be mortal, and history has been repeating that warning ever since. The end doesn't arrive with a scream from the horizon. It arrives with a whisper from the heart.